Welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute, an interdisciplinary program built around themed conversations and learning experiences. I'm Ann Stephenson, Director of Professional Development with the Lifelong Learning Team in Alumni Engagement and Development. And I'm so glad you are here for Space Policy and Society, the fourth session in our Blue Devils in Space series. Today, we are excited to explore the societal, ethical, and international implications of space exploration. Our moderator for this session is fellow Duke alum, Becky Ball, who will introduce the speakers and guide the discussion on regulation, public discourse, and legal governance. Becky is the Special Projects Delivery Manager at Space Scotland, where she leads Scotland's strategy for in-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, or ISAM, fosters cross-sector collaboration, and manages the Pivot into Space grant program. She graduated from Duke in 2025 as a Karsh International Scholar, majoring in mathematics, and served as president of Duke SEDS, Duke Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. Welcome, Becky, to the Forever Learning Institute.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I am so excited to be moderating here today and to welcome all of you to this session. I am incredibly excited for the panel of speakers we have, and I'm fortunate enough to know two of them already through some of my space activities while at Duke. So as Anne discussed, today we will be talking about space policy and why it matters, not just long into the future, but right now, and who is shaping it. So I am pleased to welcome to our panel, as you've seen on this presentation, Sabrina, Alex, and Jonathan. I will pass to each of them to introduce themselves briefly and to also discuss why does space policy matter today and what is the most important governance challenge we face in the next decade. So Sabrina, if I could pass to you first. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Everyone can hear me okay? Yes? Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me on this panel. My name is Sabrina Jawed. I am a Duke alum, graduated from Duke in 2006, then went on to law school and clerked briefly over in DC. And then I jumped over to the Federal Aviation Administration, where I have been working space law ever since. So when I started at the FAA, I did not know that the FAA had oversight over commercial launch licensing and reentry licensing. I have learned quite a bit since then. I have had the opportunity to work as a senior attorney on space law, moving up to a manager in our commercial space transportation division, and then coming back to counsel's office to manage our space law branch. And just as a little bit of perspective, when I started at the FAA 15 plus years ago, we had one attorney who worked space law, and she was part-time. We now have an entire branch working space law in the FAA, and we're at 5 attorneys now full-time. So that gives you a bit of a sense of the development over the past 15 years in commercial space law at the FAA alone. I am now the acting Deputy Assistant Chief Counsel for Regulations in counsel's office, continuing to specialize in space law, but expanding my purview a little bit into aviation and drones, which is actually proving very interesting on the space front because of the importance of integration of these commercial space vehicles into the airspace in a more seamless way. But we can talk about that more later. I do also just want to point out that the views and opinions I express today are my own. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the FAA or the Department of Transportation. And then to just briefly touch on your question, Becky, why does space policy matter today, and what are some of the important governance challenges we face? Well, first and foremost, while I continuously hear space policy and space laws being discussed as new and emerging fields, I would like to challenge that with the fact that, in fact, we were pretty established at this point. Not only that, but we are established and growing exponentially. So I think there are 3 major ways in which space policy is really important today. First of all, the economy, right? The space economy is projected to exceed $1 trillion in the coming years. The space policy and space law kind of determines the rules of the road. How do you operate when you are launching, reentering, operating site as a launch site? What kind of in-space operations are you going to do? And what are the rules surrounding those operations? It's extremely important for industry and operators to have a clear understanding of what that framework looks like, because not only is it important for investment in this economy, but it's important for operations from a safety perspective, from an economic perspective, and from a security perspective. So the economy is a huge factor in why space policy matters today, and ensuring that we get space policy right, both domestically and globally, is necessary to ensure that that economy continues to grow and to foster that growth. The second piece, and the second reason I think it's very important today, is national security. So nations are starting to integrate space into their sovereign security. You see that with the current administration in the US, and you see that globally as well. And while this is not a topic I can speak on in as much detail, I certainly think that space policy in the national security sector is extremely important. I don't think that we can continue to operate as a Wild West frontier on the security front, not only because uncertainty leads to security incidents and issues, but also because there needs to be communication globally about how national security is going to be addressed in the space context. And then finally, the last piece that I'll talk about from a policy perspective is global connectivity, right? We've got technologies like direct to device, where you have satellites connecting directly to your smartphone, that rely on things like international spectrum management and ensuring that there is policy coordination through bodies like the ITU. We make sure that our global communications networks don't suffer from interference, jamming, or other issues that could arise. And so policy is extremely important on that front. On governance challenges, there are many. Commercial space is becoming increasingly congested, which I'm sure y'all have heard. This has been frequently in the news. And that congestion directly challenges sort of the sustainability and the opportunities that are available to us in space, right? So orbital sustainability and ensuring that we are managing our orbits, particularly low Earth orbit or LEO, where most of our satellites are going, is extremely important to ensuring that, the economy, the global connectivity, and the national security prerogatives are all being maintained, addressed, etc. I would also point out that space traffic management is another really important governance challenge. And that kind of goes hand in hand, right, with orbital sustainability. How do we ensure that when you do launch a satellite, particularly a very expensive one, that it's not going to collide with another satellite, not only causing safety issues within the orbit, but also at a huge cost to the satellite owner. So space traffic management is another big one. And then what I deal with on a day-to-day basis, and what I see as another major governance challenge, is regulatory gaps, lag between innovation and regulation, and then ensuring that we are not creating a duplicative system. We'll talk a little bit about this, I think, later on during this panel. But currently within US domestic law, there is an open question about on-orbit authorization. And we have international legal obligations to ensure that when we, as a launching stage, are supporting certain launch activities and certain in-space activities, that we are providing continuous authorization and supervision of those activities. And so ensuring not only that from a government standpoint, we are meeting our obligations, but also ensuring from an industry standpoint, we are providing stability and predictability to operators that are really interested in innovating in a number of ways, is a challenge and something that I think is important to be addressed. Innovation and regulation, I constantly hear the joke that government moves at the speed of government. And I think we're very, very sensitive to that and want to ensure that the government is not stalling innovation or development in this area. And we'll talk more about kind of the things that the government is doing and interesting legal and regulatory tools that we can use to try and keep up with industry, or at least get out of the way, while ensuring that we are meeting our mission to protect public health and safety, national security, and foreign policy concerns. So I'll stop there, but looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. I already have, 5 questions to ask just you based off of that, but I will pass to Alex to answer the same question and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for the Forever Institute, a Learning Institute, for the invitation to be on such a panel with such esteemed scholars and policymakers on space law and space policy, and it's always great to be engaged when speaking with the broader Duke community. My name is Alex Lee. I'm a 2009 graduate of Duke, double majoring in biomedical engineering and economics. And after 2 years of consulting afterwards, like Sabrina, I went to law school and then clerked for a year in Oklahoma City before moving out to the West Coast, California, where I'm from, specializing and focusing on technology law. Now I'm in-house counsel at a technology company in San Diego, but by night I am a space policy and a law sort of blogger. Is a way sort of for me to learn about space law. Just as a little kid, I always wanted to be an astronaut, but once you go to law school, they weren't like probably the first people they sent out to space aren't lawyers, is most likely to engineers. And I was thinking about a way to return to my passion. And one way sort of I realized that was to try to write a blog where I think the best way to sort of learn about something is really to be able to explain it to someone else. So I started that in around 2017 and just been sort of really fascinated by how much development there has been in this space. So I think moving to the question that Becky raised, I suspect when many of you sort of saw the title of the session, you thought about astronauts on the moon, which, fingers crossed tomorrow we'll have Artemis 2 launch right around the moon, or perhaps the billionaire's next space launch rocket. But space policy isn't just about our final frontier. I think it's also about everyday activities here on Earth. If you check the weather this morning or use a navigation app recently, then you're also already a daily user of outer space. And here, I think we have really transitioned from the Apollo era of exploration to a new utilization era. Outer space isn't just a place we take photos or explore, but is also the invisible backbone of our 21st century global economy. So why does this matter now? Well, it's because for the first 50 years of the space age, the primary actors were nations. And governments typically move a little bit slower, launch a little bit infrequently, and operated under a set of treaties that were really designed to prevent conflicts from escalating. But today, that flip has really flipped. The new space era is really driven by private capital, not just tax dollars. So we're seeing thousands of satellites launch every year, not just by NASA, but by companies aiming to provide global high-speed internet service or do monitoring of the Earth kind of services, or even building AI data centers in outer space. But this means that we're starting to see a legal gap emerging. We're building a high-tech, multi-trillion-dollar orbital economy on a digital foundation, on a legal foundation that was really largely written in the 1960s and 70s. And it's useful, but there is a problem here. And what is the problem? Is because back then, we didn't really have to worry about the thousands and millions of satellites in low Earth orbit, but we do now today. And this leads to me what I believe is the most important governance challenge of the next decade. And here I completely agree with Sabrina that it is space sustainability and traffic management. So I would say think of low Earth orbit as a evolution of a roadway, right? So for decades, it was like a quiet neighborhood road with only a few cars miles apart. But today it really has transformed into a high-speed interstate highway. So if two satellites were to collide on this highway, they no longer would just cause a minor fender bender, but they can explode into fragments and create thousands of pieces of shrapnel that can travel up to 17,000 miles per hour. And this could cause the Kessler syndrome, which is a cascading chain of reaction of collisions that could eventually make certain orbits unusable for generations. But the challenge here is that space is a global commons. No one owns it, yet everyone relies on it. So we're kind of facing a classic tragedy of the commons situation where individual actors doing what's best for their own bottom line could inadvertently destroy the very environment that they need to succeed and to innovate in. And in these circumstances, over the next 10 years, the winners in space I think won't just be the ones with the best rockets. It won't be the ones with the best space technology. Like Sabrina said, they will be the ones who help establish the rules of the road because that's super important right now in outer space. We need clear, enforceable norms for things like debris mitigation or mission authorization for non-traditional activities like building gas stations in outer space or mining asteroids or lunar surface for resources. Because if we don't create a stable, predictable legal environment now, the investment could dry up and the risk could become unmanageable. So, what I want to leave you with is that space law isn't just for lawyers. It's actually for anyone who cares about how we manage our orbital environment. Because if we get the policy wrong today, we don't just lose the stars, we actually could lose the technology that keeps our modern world running today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Professor Weiner, I will pass over to you to introduce yourself as well and to answer the same question. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks also to the Duke Alumni Office and Forever Learning Institute. It's really terrific to have this series of webinars or gatherings online about space policy, and so great to be with my alumni colleagues, with Becky and Sabrina and Alex. And I just want to note that before Becky became a space professional, last year she was a member of our Bass Connections project, which is a special kind of 1-year multidisciplinary course that's a research project, which was on future space settlements, lessons from history. So I'm a professor primarily in Duke Law School and also in the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. And I co-direct the Duke Center on Risk, which is a university-wide research center. And a lot of my work is on regulation of risks and indeed on how the world is full of multiple risks. And in order to make progress, we need to be able to deal with multiple risks at the same time and with the interactions, such as when we try to regulate one risk that might also affect other risks. So I really enjoyed the comments by Sabrina and Alex and agree with the points that they've raised. Another way to see why space policy matters so much today is to think back through that, say, 5 decades history, back to the 1960s, first time that humans landed on the moon, all in 1969, also the time when the Outer Space Treaty was adopted in 1967, and then think how much has changed since then. So as Sabrina and Alex indicated, space law is not brand new, but the space law from the 1960s and 70s is under a lot of pressure today from the new developments. In the 1960s, there were essentially 2 main spacefaring nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, and others gathering their efforts. Today, there are many nations launching rockets and approximately 75 or more national governments that are sending payloads into space, that are spacefaring countries. And there's been an enormous growth in private space activities, as Alex was emphasizing. And so the need for coordination and innovation, but also governance of private space activities is so much greater now than it was back in the 1960s. And the Outer Space Treaty only gives hints about the oversight of private space activities. The very language that Sabrina and Alex quoted about authorization and continuing supervision. And so I think that's one big challenge and question for space governance today is how will that responsibility for authorization and continuing supervision really be carried out. Another way to see the increase is the satellites issue that both Sabrina and Alex mentioned, where just 15 years ago, well into the 2000s, there were on the order of hundreds to 1,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. And now there are maybe more than 14,000, or that may be already more than that, and plans to have many thousands more. And there's even a comment in the chat about just 2 companies having 22,000 spacecraft in low Earth orbit, and with projections for hundreds of thousands. And so that illustrates the enormous growth of the economic opportunity, the geopolitical importance of communications and also intelligence and military satellites, potential for conflict in Earth orbit, but also and the need for cooperation and governance to address problems like space debris. And we can talk more about that. I just want to add that a lot of my interest in space law goes beyond Earth orbit to whether we will have settlements on the moon and the question of mining resources on the moon or asteroids, or what are the rules for property law, property rights in outer space, or potentially on Mars or elsewhere. And then questions of settling more permanent human bases on the moon, on Mars, elsewhere. And if we do so, what would be the legal rules of these new societies? How would that be decided? Who would make the laws of Mars? And furthermore, how would we then have relations across planets? So I published an article last year with a Duke alum, Chase Hamilton, my former student, called Interplanetary Risk Regulation. And that is going beyond current space law to the question of if we have bases or settlements or space stations orbiting around or on the surface of other celestial bodies, we'll come to need a kind of interplanetary relations that goes beyond the international relations we have here on Earth.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for flagging the best connections. I should have said as well that that was actually how I met Alex, was during my research. I came across the spacebar. So it was quite fun to see that you were both going to be on this panel when I was asked to moderate. Just to say that the first couple of questions I ask, I will direct to one of you, but please do respond and interact and build on each other's ideas. We'll keep this as much of a flowing conversation as possible. So don't just wait for me to throw a question to you. But my first question, Sabrina, if I can ask you, it would be, given the increasing number of private actors and orbital congestion, as we've been speaking about, how do US regulations keep pace?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. That's a great question, and one that we're constantly iterating on. So I will speak briefly on the orbital congestion piece, just because my colleagues at Department of Commerce are certainly much more involved in the system than we are. But on the orbital congestion, interestingly, one of the ways that the U.S. government has decided to address this issue is transitioning civil space traffic management to the Department of Commerce. So currently, or previously, I should say, space traffic management was largely coordinated by the DoD, and a lot of that information was not necessarily releasable. And so by transferring the portion of space traffic management that is civil over to the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Commerce has been developing a system called TRACS, which is the Traffic Coordination System for Space. They launched it earlier this year, and it is actually the first modern sort of civil GPS for space traffic, and provides satellite operators with real-time collision warnings. And this is important because now satellite operators kind of have that information so that they have an understanding of what collision risks exist for their satellites and in the orbits that they would like to place those satellites. And I should back up and say that the FAA does have a limited role in sort of collision avoidance. As part of the launch licensing process, there is information that an operator, so a launch operator, basically the person who's operating the rocket, has to submit to the FAA related to their payload. And the FAA will check that information to ensure that there will not be any direct collision risk within a certain period of time. But because the FAA's authority is limited just to sort of that launch phase, you do have, obviously, bless you, additional collision risk that exists post-launch. And that's the information and data that TRACS is also able to provide. So commercial integration of this information, unlike when the military was cataloging this information. TRACS is actually incorporating data from private sensors. So I think Leo Labs or K-Hound Space is providing some of this information, which creates a more accurate, transparent, and sort of up-to-date and real-time map of essentially the orbital commons. So this is a specific example of the government kind of transitioning a system from a way that wasn't working, that was inflexible and perhaps not as up-to-date, to one that is hopefully more flexible and provides more useful information in real time. And then something near and dear to my heart, which is sort of the launch and reentry licensing regulations and how the US government addresses regulations generally. So the FAA recently in government terms, went through a complete overhaul of the launch and reentry licensing requirements and created what we call our new Part 450 regulations. And the whole purpose of going through this exercise was to create a body of regulations that would apply to launch and reentry that were performance-based. Now, in the regulatory world, we refer to regulations as performance-based when they set a safety standard, but they provide complete flexibility to an operator in terms of how they want to meet that standard. So we don't say you have to build your rocket this way. We say your rocket has to meet this risk threshold, right? So previously, FAA requirements were based on Air Force requirements when it came to launch and reentry, and they were extremely prescriptive. So we had reams and reams and reams of appendices about how you do your testing and how you get your data and what that data has to look like. And the other difference was that our previous regulations for launch and reentry would not allow an operator to launch from multiple sites. It was a very limited envelope. So if you wanted to expand your envelope or modify that envelope, you could do that in limited circumstances, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And you might have to come back and get a new launch license. That's pretty timely. Instead, the idea is under Part 450, you could have a much larger envelope of operations, and that launch license or reentry license would cover all of those operations. So you could operate within those operating parameters. So this is important because providing regulatory frameworks that allow for flexibility and innovation while still maintaining safety standards is hopefully going to get us closer to keeping pace with industry. Now, Part 450 has received a lot of critique, and the agency is certainly kind of continuing to hone those requirements. In fact, for those of you that are following the executive orders that are coming out, there have been executive orders that have already directed the department to look at further improving upon those regulations in order to kind of foster and nurture the space economy. And we are absolutely doing that. There's always room for improvement. To that end, the agency has the ability to engage with industry in a number of different ways. So we have what we call federal advisory committees. Those operate under FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and we have one specifically for commercial space called ComStack. And that is a committee that is established and that provides recommendations to the agency on a number of topics. We also have a slightly more flexible industry engagement tool, which we refer to as Sparks. They are space rulemaking committees, space advisory rulemaking committees. And the agency is able to put together these committees of stakeholders, usually when the agency is considering a rulemaking, and kind of pose very specific questions to industry about how we should craft a regulation, how we should fix a regulation. We've had them recently for Part 460, which is our human spaceflight requirements, which is a bit of a misnomer because we are under a moratorium, so we don't actually have many of those, but we are planning for the future. For Part 440, which is our insurance and financial responsibility requirements, and then also more recently for addressing concerns with Part 450. So these are some tools that the agency can use to kind of engage directly with industry, because when we do issue rules, we want to make sure that they're correct. And then, of course, the notice and comment process that is part and parcel with the Administrative Procedure Act, and making sure that we are considering comments that come through that process as well. So those are some ways that we try to ensure that we are keeping pace by creating performance-based requirements that are in line with what our stakeholders are looking for and what will most help them kind of move forward while still obviously always preserving safety.
Thank you so much. I think you've hit on such a key point whenever we talk about regulation, and it's something that I'm finding consistently in my role at the moment, that industry has an aversion to regulation from the get-go and trying to, kind of make them become friends with the regulators and be informed in the creation of regulation is really key. So that's fantastic to hear about that process. Alex, if I can direct the next question to you, please. So public interest often comes from podcasts and blogs and pop culture more than formal publications. How does this help shape policy?
Yeah, so I think sort of building on Sabrina's answer there is that now you sort of see a policymaker really wanting to work with industry, which is great. So it means that there's a sort of a fascinating shift, right? In the past, space policy was kind of more ivory tower stuff, right? Only known to a few elites, so to speak. But now sort of with the FAA and sort of other regulatory agency wanting to more work with the public, you want those conversations to no longer to be discussed in, say, UN basements or in thick academic journals with like 2-year publication cycles that I'm sure Jonathan is very used to. Not that there isn't a place for it, but when space today is sort of like moving at what I like to call Silicon Valley speed, we have like weekly launches and rapid hardware iterations. If a policy conversation sort of takes place over 18 months just to reach sort of like a peer-reviewed journal or gets locked away in the basement until it sort of surfaces at the end, it could essentially become obsolete by the time it sort of hits the shelf, right? There's still a place to play for those, but we really need to sort of have a more informal world coming in. And this is this world of like podcasts and social media and blogs my own. I think we sort of can play that role, right? So we can sort of provide that real-time feedback loop for a fast moving industry. So I think a perfect example of this would be the Planetary Society's annual Day of Action, right? So they would actually take thousands of space enthusiasts, people who aren't necessarily rocket scientists or lawyers, but who listen to their podcasts and read their updates, and they turn them into citizen advocates, right? And when these people show up on Capitol Hill or email their representatives, they can start speaking a language of what I like to call regulatory literacy that they learn from the digital media. So it's no longer as arcane or like hard to reach for a lot of people. And I think that could sort of shape policy in 3 different ways. It can really force administrative organs to really realize that the public is watching now, not just 5 years from now when the policy sort of gets enacted. And second, if a new regulation is confusing or insufficient, I think one thing Sabrina mentioned was Part 450 regulation was a way to sort of streamline the regulations that was out there already and definitely improve a lot of the process out there. But there's still more work to do there, right? So then the Space Internet sort of analyzes it, and then it kind of can create sort of more immediate pressure for clarity, right? And you can sort of work with the regulators to sort of figure out what the clarity is. And finally, for company to succeed, I think they need public buy-in, right? And blogs and podcasts can take these complex legal filings or these regulations. For instance, I actually wrote a blog piece. I'll try to send it to you later, Sabrina, to get your thoughts on the Part 450 regulations, where I was trying to create a flowchart to it, right? And it's more streamlined for sure, but there's still a lot of sort of legal language in there. And we try to translate them into a conversation about what kind of future we can build from the regulations. And I think it's great because now the administrative agencies, like Sabrina said, they're definitely more than willing to work with the public and work with industry. But everyone sort of need to have that regulatory literacy. And so, in short, I think space is moving faster than ever before. So the conversation really has to keep pace with the people. And right now, even though the ivory tower libraries has a place to play, we definitely need a more informal world to come in. And so that's where a lot of the that people can get their information. It's in their podcasts and their YouTube clips. It's in their AirPods while they're going on a run or driving to work and things around that nature. So that's the role I think the social media and podcasts can play in this modern space age.
Thank you. Yes. I'm really pushing for Space Scotland to start a podcast. So I'll keep you in the loop on that and maybe pour some Duke alums into it when I hopefully get given the thumbs up, however many months down the line. But I think you're completely correct. Public interest comes through AirPods nowadays. You're listening to something, you're watching a reel, and it's how you engage future talent in the industry as well and educate them. Thank you. Jonathan, if I can pass this question to you. With more nations and commercial actors in space, how should international law and governance evolve to address these emerging challenges?
Yeah. Just by the way, quick comment on the last question about popular culture. It's interesting how much science fiction, whether that's in books or movies or television shows, enables a common conversation about things that we have not yet experienced. But it's really playing a role of not only entertainment, but envisioning or imagining future scenarios. And I find that comes up so often, including among technical experts. So on your question about the international arena, yeah, there's real challenges to the international legal regime for space now. So we mentioned the Outer Space Treaty from 1967, which has, most countries of the world are parties. Something like 116 countries are parties to the Outer Space Treaty. And it has some very important key provisions, as Sabrina mentioned, on peaceful uses of outer space and no weapons of mass destruction stationed in space. And it has key provisions on countries avoiding harmful interference with each other and giving due regard to each other's interests. And it also has a key provision saying that no national government can appropriate outer space or celestial bodies by claims of sovereignty or use or occupation. So essentially saying, when the United States landed on the moon and planted the US flag, it was not claiming ownership of the moon or that the moon was somehow US territory, and likewise for other national governments. Okay, but some key challenges today. One is that there are increasingly subgroups, which in the literature might be called plurilateral rather than multilateral global agreements like the Outer Space Treaty and by the way, follow-on agreements on rescue of astronauts, registration of space objects, liability for harms caused, all from the 1970s. Now we have a new plurilateral regime called the Artemis Accords, which is kind of a political commitment rather than a official legal treaty, but it has something like 56 or more parties now, and that's engaging the United States, Europe, Japan, India, and other major spacefaring countries, but not China and Russia. So there's a second or counterpart plurilateral group led by China with Russia and others. And so that's an interesting development, is to see these two groups or blocks and how that will evolve over the future, including constructing space stations, potentially bases on the moon, and further activities. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think these issues of international governance beyond the current decade, we can think not only of space over the last 50 years, from landing on the moon and the early treaties to today, but also over the last 500 years or more, from settlements and colonization on Earth to now we might be on the cusp of settlements off Earth. And so increasingly the question will be, if that comes to pass, the question will be not only relations among nations on Earth, international law, but also relations among the settling actors on other planets. So we might have more than one legal regime on the moon or on another planet, and we might have interplanetary relations. And I'll just finish by saying one of the questions that the Outer Space Treaty kind of left open is whether private actors can claim resources in outer space. Even if national governments cannot appropriate or claim sovereignty, what about private actors? And it's interesting that the US Congress back in 2015 enacted a law saying that US citizens can have effectively property rights to resources they extract in outer space. And that was followed by a few other countries, Luxembourg, Japan, United Arab Emirates, passing similar laws. So there's a coming question or possibly conflict over the question whether private actors authorized by these national laws can claim resources in space.
Amazing. Thank you. Yes, I remember we spoke a lot about the kind of ambiguity in the Outer Space Treaty and our Bath connections. And in anything that I read about space law now, you obviously see questions about that. So just a reminder to everyone who's watching, please do submit some questions in the chat. We will start taking those soon. In the meantime, I'm going to ask a question that's open to all of you. And I am going to ask, I've got a few questions that I'm trying to decide between. I think I'm going to ask that as humanity moves beyond Earth orbit, and I think, Jonathan, you'll then particularly like this question, what ethical principles should guide exploration and resource use, as you just touched upon? But it is open to all of you. Please feel free to jump in.
You want me to start on that? So that's an important question. And at our Duke Space Symposium a year ago in April 2025, our keynote speaker was Erika Nesvold, who's a scientist, but wrote a book about ethics called Off Earth, Questions and Quandaries for if we go to outer space. And I think she does a really good job of addressing a number of the ethical questions and pros and cons and debates without always trying to give a conclusion. One that's been interesting to me recently is that the outer space, and I have a new paper coming out on this issue, that the Outer Space Treaty says in Article 1 that outer space will be open to access by all states on Earth. And it also says that the exploration and use of outer space is the province of all mankind. That's the English version. And that phrase, that the exploration and use is the province of all mankind, it's kind of an odd phrase in international law. That word province doesn't show up in a lot of other international agreements. The law of the sea and an agreement called the Moon Agreement from 1979, which only has, I think, 17 parties, but they use a different phrase, common heritage of mankind, which has a very, actually potentially opposite meaning to province of all mankind. So if common heritage of mankind means that resources are owned in common and no one country or actor can get access until they get permission, as with, say, the deep seabed. By contrast, province of all mankind seems to mean open access, that anyone can go to space. And so it had in the 1960s and 70s, the ethic of province of all mankind was a highly egalitarian ethic, that it wasn't just the big players, the first movers, the first spacefaring countries, but all countries should be able to share. And indeed, province of all mankind refers not just to countries or states, but to humanity. And the phrase mankind is often revised nowadays to say humankind. At the same time, this phrase, province of all mankind, seems to suggest that the entire universe is open to the exploration and use of human beings. And that's even more clear in some of the other versions. The French version uses a word, appanage, which is related to inheritance. And the Chinese version uses a word that's more like business or development. And so they all suggest that while they're sharing among all the peoples of the earth, they're suggesting that the earth or humans on earth have the a kind of privilege to explore and use all of outer space. All right. Even back in the 1960s, there were leading books in space law before the Outer Space Treaty talking about what if we meet extraterrestrial life in outer space, and how can we manage our relations with extraterrestrials. And books by Alex Haley and Ernst Fazan and Modesto Vasquez and others really, really concerned about this question in the 1960s. So it's possible, not likely, but possible that we will confront the same question again. And this idea that is we will meet or encounter or identify life off the earth. And that might be intelligent, technologically advanced life, or it might be microorganisms. But this idea that the Outer Space Treaty can declare for human beings that we have the province or the inheritance or the right to develop all of outer space, starting with our moon and every other celestial body in the universe, seems like that will have to give way if we encounter other life, that we will confront ethical and legal questions and maybe questions of power about our relations with life off the earth. That may be kind of out there in space and out there in time, but it's interesting to see the ethic that was embedded in that Article 1 of the OST and how much we would rethink that today.
Yeah, and I like to sort of just add on to Jonathan's. I think that's a really great point, right? So the ethical quandaries that sort of could come up with in sort of space that's infinitesimally large, right? Outer space is something that, like, to what Buzz Lightyear like to say, infinity beyond. And I think there's also, so that's definitely a great ethical consideration we have. I also like to put another twist to this question a little bit, is that I think when we talk about the ethics of exploration, we also have to sort of move, it's more of the economic ethics, right? We have to I think we have to move past the 20th century disposable mindset. And this relates to what Sabrina, I'm sure, is doing. And when Jonathan's sort of talking about sort of environment and risks, Jonathan's a very famous, like I read some of his work on sort of environmentalized, top notch too. And what I mean by here is that, first of all, we have the tyranny of the rocket equation, right? It is incredibly expensive to lift mass out of Earth's gravity. So every kilogram we send up is a precious asset that we have like already paid a heavy gravity tax on. And so treating a multi-million-dollar sort of satellite as single use, I feel like is a form of economic sabotage really to ourselves, right? So I think the future really belongs to like a circular space economy where we can sort of recycle and manufacture and using the materials that we have already in orbit. And second, we're already starting to realize, and this is a topic that came up during sort of the space symposium last week, and sort of Sabrina also sort of, I'm sure there's a lot of work being sort of the FAA and CC are working on this, is we're realizing that the deorbiting, burning up satellites in the atmosphere isn't the cleanest solution that we once thought, right? It's leaving these metallic traces in the stratosphere that can linger for years, potentially affecting our ozone, and sort of related to the questions I see from the audience in there. And I think this is where sort of the ethics sort of can come in and actually unify two groups that we don't think is usually unified. We can really tie together the technologists and the environmentalists together, right? So I think we can sort of use this concept of how do we solve these issues by designing sort of on-orbit servicing and reuse, where we both can protect Earth's atmosphere and make the space exploration even more affordable, right? And so I think the winner of the next decade won't be the one who launched the most stuff up in outer space. It will also be the one who can do the most with the stuff that's already out there. So I think that's also another economic ethics question that we might have to deal with soon too.
Yeah, definitely. Sabrina, would you like to add any comments before I go to audience questions?
No, you can go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the first question that we had in from our audience was, how do you coordinate with the ITU? So Sabrina, I think that one is probably most directed to you.
Sure. So I can speak on this at a very high level because this is actually handled by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. But the ITU is it is a sort of a global organization, the International Telecommunication Union. I should clarify, we use so many acronyms. And the point of the ITU is to ensure, at least on the space side, that there isn't interference happening amongst space activity that's being promulgated by different nations. And in fact, private actors can't go directly to the ITU. It's the governments of the states that are sponsoring the individual actors' activities that would go to the ITU. And generally speaking, what happens is that those organizations associated with the government, so for example, the FCC would go to the ITU and they would create a filing. And the filing would include, at a very high level, sort of information about the activity, and the ITU would ensure that that activity wasn't going to interfere with other activities that they have on file. So that is my cliff notes on kind of ITU coordination, but important to know that it happens sort of at the nation-to-nation level. And that if there is an interference identified, that the ITU is sort of responsible for figuring out how to address that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Another question that we've had is, how are geostationary orbital slots impacted by all the low Earth orbits? This audience member referenced Amazon trying to compete with Starlink, and we've got tens of thousands of LEO satellites just for 2 companies alone. Are there concerns about light pollution, transmission interference, and the daily re-entry of multiple LEO spacecrafts? Would anyone like to take that? Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak on it very briefly. Is that I think that's a fair question. It's a great question. I think there's definitely a lot of concerns there, and it also kind of relates to the ITU a little bit. And actually, why the ITU sort of comes up for me is it was one of my first blog posts on my blog. I was kind of studying into the ITU, how they sort of license geostationary orbit, right? Because geostationary orbital licensing is actually very different from low Earth orbit. And definitely correct me if I'm wrong here, Jonathan and Serena, but like low Earth orbit sort of kind of operates on a first come, first serve kind of like right now sort of trajectory where people, and that's why a lot of people, mega constellations and company are really trying to get their satellites up in the air to sort of kind of take over the space. Whereas geostationary orbit is essentially, it's a very finely tuned process managed by the ITUs that's working through national agencies. So if you are curious about that, I tried to translate that in one of my first blog posts on my blog. So there's a difference between how they're licensing, because I think the geostationary orbit is such a unique orbit where like any satellite that's at a specific geostationary position is sort of traveling at the same orbital speed as sort of how Earth is moving. So you can see how once you have something that's launched right up there, it will always point to the same exact location on Earth. So it's a very powerful sort of orbital position. And so I think right now, I think geostationary orbits, to the question, is much more better managed in terms of the satellites going up there. We do really need to start working about sort of LEO constellations because it's less like, it's more first come, first serve. So how do we, I think we need to create more incentive structure to really figure out how these companies are taking up those slots in LEO. I actually just published a law review article on it's called Zigzagging Outer Space, where I sort of talk about some of these issues as well. But it's not a question where we have clear answers for, but this is where sort of the citizen advocacy, I think, really comes in, right? I think you have sort of the ability sort of study these issues more and really ask them like, hey, how do we sort of unite the astronomy communities, right? They're working on light reflection technology to figure out how do we reduce the light pollution. But I don't know if the technology is all the way there yet. So I think we definitely need to have more both policies and incentives for companies to do the appropriate thing to help sort of protect our dark side. But at the same time, right, technological innovation sometimes it puts up to boundaries. So how do we do the right compromise and negotiate one that works for both parties? It's going to be tough.
Thank you very much. And then this will be our final question that I will ask one or all of you to answer fairly quickly. So this audience member referenced Artemis Accords and certain countries not having signed it. Jonathan, you beat me to the punch, sending that link and showing that some of those countries have signed, and there are some South American and African countries. The question was regarding, do countries and nations who haven't signed, does their reluctance to join the Artemis Accords suggest that there are more conflicts ahead? And they also reference that it seems questionable that the US is spending more money on a new space launch location in Texas when the ESA launch location in French Guiana has several advantages. They also asked, is there anything in the works like the Artemis Accords for Mars missions? So if anyone wants to pick up any of those questions, I'll pass that over to you.
Well, I'll just comment very briefly. I can't comment on all of those points, but I think the Artemis Accords are interesting because they have advanced bilaterally. That is, rather than a multilateral negotiation with all the countries around a table, so to speak, or in a large negotiating hall. I believe that, and maybe Alex or Sabrina may correct or clarify this, the United States drafted the Artemis Accords and then essentially brokered them to each country one at a time for signature. And that's an interesting strategy in international relations. A second point is that some really important countries joining, in addition to the United States, Europe, Japan, Canada, etc., were India, and major new spacefaring country. India has landed on the moon, and the geopolitics of India joining was quite important. And another interesting one is Saudi Arabia, which I think that Saudi Arabia withdrew from the Moon Agreement in order to join the Artemis Accords, and that relates to this question of property claims on the moon or to resources in outer space, where the Artemis Accords has a section saying that the extraction of resources and claims of rights to extract resources are not inherently in conflict with Outer Space Treaty Article 2, which prohibits the national appropriation by sovereignty, etc. And the Artemis Accords also have one other section that flows from the Outer Space Treaty provision on avoiding harmful interference with other state parties and their interests. The Artemis Accords has a section on safety zones or avoiding conflicts by establishing safety zones. And that is interesting because the safety zones may be temporary, but the longer they last, the more they might start to look like national appropriation. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Thank you very much. I'm always shocked at how quickly a panel discussion, the time disappears, but we are unfortunately at the end of our panel. So I'm just going to ask each of you to give us a one-sentence brief takeaway on space policy, why it matters today, or anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we conclude. Alex, if I could start with you.
Ooh, one sentence. That's going to be tough. So I guess two sentences maybe is that I think the rules we write in this decade essentially are going to become the blueprint for the next century. I think we're definitely at a pivotal crossroads. So I would just say let's make sure those blueprints are as resilient and as visionary as the technology we're launching. And let's stop treating our orbits as a graveyard and start building it as our first off-world foundry.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jonathan.
I just add to all that we've said, there's been a great discussion that if we, over the next several decades, start to have settlements on the moon or Mars or elsewhere, we will face the question of who makes the laws for those and whether those laws are made from Earth or whether the settlers make their own laws, which is itself the question that became the United States or other countries that were previously colonies and then gained independence. So I think we may face that same question in outer space.
Definitely. Thank you. And then Sabrina.
I think I would just say that the development of space policy and law is a tricky process. It is meant to be deliberative, and so some pause is important. But if we create policy and law too slowly I think we are jeopardizing the burgeoning economy, the burgeoning creators and innovators. And so it's finding that medium that is so essential.
Definitely. Thank you so much again to our wonderful panelists for just such an incredible discussion. Thank you all for being here and listening and for asking questions as well. I know there's been a message in the chat to please fill out a feedback survey about this session, so please do take 2 to 3 minutes to do that. Thank you again for joining us, and Anne, I can pass back to you to close up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky, Sabrina, Alex, and Jonathan, for a great session, and to our audience for joining us today.